to our second lecture of today's program. As you can see from the program, the second lecture is Danijela Dolenec from Zagreb. She's an assistant professor of political science at University of Zagreb and an activist in the Zagreb is Ours political platform. The title of Danijela's lecture is The Left in the European Periphery, From Crisis to Renewal. And as is stated in the abstract, the lecture will consist of, say, 3 parts. In the first one, Danijela will outline the new grammar of political conflict in contemporary Europe, especially concerning the rise of the new right, so-called new right populists. In the second part, she will analyze the distinct features of this post-socialist Europe in that context, and in third part, drawing on these key signs before, she will make, as said, tentative proposals for left interventions. As today, the procedure is the same. The lecture will last about 40-45 minutes, and after we have a shorter discussion, and after a short break, we will have a general discussion which will discuss questions and problems that we heard and already discussed in some degree in the first lecture, and also about some broader questions about Danijela's lecture. Please, just this is the same list of participants as in the morning, so please sign only those of you that weren't here in the morning. So, Danijela, please.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming, for taking the time for this presentation or talk. I am rather unhappy that I cannot. This is a consequence of over-reliance, perhaps, on models and on data. But I like to show my slides because it makes it easier for everyone to be kind of on the same page. But we'll circumvent this problem with a classical pedagogical tool, which is pen and paper, which will allow me to progress faster. That's what I want to do, because I think that in the 3 parts that Marko just read from the summary of what I want to tell you today, I think that the first part and a large part of the second part of the talk is common ground. We will agree. It's just that, so I won't be breaking new ground in terms of telling you things you've not read before. But I need it, I use it, because I think that by being precise in how we describe the current conjuncture, so what we think are the key or fundamental aspects of political conflict today, should inform us in how we then articulate left interventions, meaning parts of, we call it modestly left strategy, meaning how we should go about both political organizing, but also articulation of the political struggle. So that's what I plan to do, which means that some parts of my talk are mostly. So I start from a very broad brush, meaning that I treat Europe as if, and Europe constituting also this part of Europe as a whole, and I think that there are elements of characteristics of today which are common. So I first talk about that, and then I say in which ways I think that Eastern Europe or the Southeast or the Balkans are in a particular predicament, and from there I draw lessons for what I call left interventions. So that's the plan, and I'm okay with being interrupted as I go along. If you feel that you need to ask something which is a clarification or any kind of question, it can come whenever, and I will then decide whether I think I need to address it immediately or afterwards. So I'm fine with being interrupted. I think that's also fine. Okay, so when I've cleared that, let me then show you my first slide, which is a basic coordinate system. Looks like this. It's usually called like a political compass. And if nowhere else, you've probably encountered it on Facebook or places like that, when you answer questions about your political views on various issues, and then you turn out to be left or right. populist or not, radical or moderate, and so on. So this is because in a lot of political science analysis we assume competition or conflict takes place through a spatial metaphor. So this is supposed to be space, and generally in a lot of literature you will find, of course, various articulations of these conflicts, but generally they can be subsumed under two basic types of conflicts. This one is usually called territorial cultural, and I'll put here like universalism, and this tradition. And this one usually referred to as socioeconomic in the literature, or class conflict. So we can say, kind of love capitalism versus anti-capitalism, or whatever. So in the various literatures and in the analysis of party competition and ways in which political conflict is articulated in particular countries and in particular periods of time, these will vary. What are the actual topics of conversation will vary, as well as whether kind of the mainstream parties of the left and right and their competitors on the left and right, how close they stay to the center. So sometimes in some periods, for instance, the second part of the 20th century, the story went that this cleavage was largely pacified. So these kinds of conflicts were usually then referred to as distributional conflicts, in the sense of whether the state should be larger or smaller, whether there should be more economic liberty or less, rather than being specified as I've put it here, more kind of anti-capitalist versus more. So all of this to say that this is a space, and this is an analytical model which obviously grossly oversimplifies what is going on in any country and in any given space, but it allows for some kinds of starting analysis for comparativists like me, who look at various countries and try to see what is similar across space. And another thing that I need to say is this is used both to analyze parties' positions. So we can say traditionally you would put Christian Democrats here, and you would put Social Democrats here in the second part of the 20th century. Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, okay? So it's used as a space which then allows us to think about how new parties, when they come up, how they compete, whether they think about, okay, if this space is already taken, should I, combine appeals here, or should I, radicalize. So it's used for kind of analysis of the logic of competition. But at the same time, because of course, a lot of this literature assumes that we live in a system of representative democracy in which parties are supposed to be aggregating and representing interests, then this is also used as a space to describe actual social, what we call social cleavages, or actual social groups with interests. So the same space can be used to say, okay, perhaps a stronger role for the state, stronger, social justice claims and so on are in the interest of the majority, if we think so, and then wonder whether this is represented or not. So I'm trying to delineate kind of several ways in which this can be used, and I think I broadly try to use it as a mechanism for class analysis, to figure out what is going on and how are particular, in any given context, like the Swiss context or the French or the Croatian, how are these struggles articulated and by whom? And I'm also able to use this to say, okay, we have, for instance, social and economic indicators which say there are large groups in whose interest this kind of articulation would be, but why? Is there someone representing them or not? So these are the kinds of uses I think this can be put to. And it also corresponds to, for instance, conceptions of justice such as Nancy Fraser, redistribution, recognition. So I think it's useful as long as we don't use it dogmatically. So what I'll try to do is first show its usefulness and then also break it down later on to say, what are the limits of that usefulness. Okay, so all of this as an introduction to make it easier than to go through some of the next points. put very briefly, the second half of the 20th century in Western Europe, we could say this represented largely kind of the parliamentary space of political struggle. This was the Christian Democrats, or the main party on the center right, and this the main party of the center left, which meant that in most of these countries, 60 to 80% of the voters were distributed among these two parties. And then they had competitors like liberal parties here, or they also had some regional parties, agrarian parties here, depending on various other institutional aspects. Then the story of what is the key change in the late 20th century is this. Yeah? So Social Democrats move over here. This is called the third way. Third way. Because, and this has been analyzed, I don't need to tell this audience about how at the moment in which a party platform starts from the idea that further economic liberalization is a given, and that removing barriers to movement of capital, services, goods, and people is a must. It cannot be reversed. That if you take this as a starting point, this means that you're over here, you're abandoning what was kind of the historical mission, so to say. Why is this relevant? Well, because a lot of, again, earlier literature and analysis was saying, was explaining the relevance of the two cleavages, and now the result is that you only have one cleavage left, which is important because the consequence of this is a strengthening of cultural types of conflict, cultural wars, as we call them, because the main parties, the main party platforms, their key distinction is no longer revolves around an alternative economic project, an alternative economic and social goals, but rather on delineating various types of cultural conflicts. So, and here then we need to further specify, whether we're talking Western Europe or Eastern Europe, because as we know, if we look at all empirical data for Croatia since the beginning of the 90s, the dominant cleavage can be abbreviated to ethnic Croat Catholic. So, and it's here, so it's a right-wing hegemony to which the left is offering feeble, declarative support of human rights, be there ethnic rights, be there, gender equality, and so on. But they're trying to defend universal values by in a way, accepting the logic of a cultural struggle. And we can see now, 20 years later, that this is a sure road to defeat if you're trying to, maintain the value of minorities by declaring that they have equal value. Okay, so that's, I think, the key thing to understand about what the structure of kind of political conflict looks like in Europe at the end of the 20th century. And this is the moment in which Eastern European countries, as we know, also accept a pluralist party competition in the moment of, as we call it, end of history, whereby we, all the parties of former communist parties are forced and kind of eager to adopt a European social democratic outlook, which means that they immediately adopt this position on the kind of party competition space. After that, what also happens in the 21st century is an extension of this basic dynamic. I think that's very important to understand. And why I'm telling the story is because I want to give a perspective on what we call the right-wing populism. One of the consequences of the fact that this is a dominant cleavage in a period in which economic globalization leads to, and I know that also you will know this story, new groups of winners and losers, meaning certain groups, urban, educated, with the right social capital and credentials, which are benefiting from further economic integration, from freedom of movement of capital, goods, labor, and so on. And then many other groups, many other social groups, which in this context have fewer and fewer chances. This is, I think, it's an important formulation because it talks about a relative worsening of position, both for those who are already at the bottom, socially, but also for the many in the middle class and in the lower middle classes. So these are all the topics that have already been addressed in the morning, of precarious work and kind of this, as Stipe was writing in the introductory text, the generalized sense of insecurity that is felt. And so what some of the political scientists were saying, we actually have a new cleavage, a new articulation of the political conflict along more integration versus demarcation, closing off of the borders. And these are what Hans-Peter Krisi and others call political potentials. So it's something that's there as a social demand for more protection, a feeling of insecurity which needs to be addressed. And then it opens up empirically the question, who addresses these feelings of insecurity, which are of various provenances. Some of it is existential economic insecurity, but it's also insecurity over, how the world is changing at a fast pace. Where is all this going? How is my neighborhood changing? Some of these are, we could call them, neurosis of the middle class, but it's still an insecurity that is felt. Some of it is over changing gender relations and changing relations within work organizations. So all of this kind of mixed together creates new demands for a sense of security. And that's something that's a socially, a present demand. And the question is, which political forces are able to articulate this? And we know the answer. The answer has been what the literature generally calls right-wing populists. I'm not super happy with that formulation, and I'll try to explain why. So the political consequences of economic globalization is, as we said, all the mainstream parties formulate winners' programs. And the only distinction between the center left and the center right is that the left declaratively still says we will preserve the welfare state, or we will protect the ones that are most affected by changes in the labor market and so on. But it's basically a winners program, which means that for those tentatively called the losers, their demands are then, we wonder whether they can be represented here and here, in both of these spaces, in none of these spaces, or what has been happening. Where have they been? And Hans-Peter Krisi and his colleagues would argue that the populist right has been most successful in appealing to the interests and fears of these, what they call losers of globalization. And not only that, they claim that right-wing populism is the driving force of transformation of the party systems in the West. What does that mean, driving force? Well, it means that the way they articulate the current conjuncture, the way they see the problem and the solutions that they offer to the current problems affect everybody else. Everybody else is forced into either conceding ground, meaning adopting some of the argumentation and some of the solutions, or again reacting to what they put on the agenda as key claims. So that means that you could say that the two-dimensionality survives in a sense, and they would put the populist right over here, the new radical right, somewhere here, new radical right, which means that they have a stronger, a stronger articulation of the cultural conflict, and we know the appeals or the topics are generally anti-immigration, xenophobia, or even racism. Combined with, in Western Europe, Euroscepticism and a critique of the overall of the European Union and so on, while in its counterparts in Eastern Europe, like in Poland or in Hungary, this articulation is focused on social conservatism on the one hand, so a very strongly conservative agenda regarding reproductive rights and the role of the church in life, but also Euroscepticism and an othering, which then, for instance, in the Polish context, is directed at, for instance, Jews. In the Hungarian context, is directed against Roma and other minorities, and so on. So what Krisi and his colleagues are argumenting is that what has changed are the topics, but that we still see a very strong articulation of kind of cultural conflicts. And then the question in the literature and a lot of the debates in the current political science literature is this true? Like, do the new right-wing parties indeed maintain actually all the elements of an economic liberal program? It's just that they don't address them. They address the cultural. So the way they see, the way they explain the problems and how they offer the solutions is within a cultural conflict. But is their program something that's, more of the same? Or are they perhaps addressing, because there is, elements of economic protectionism, reintroduction of tariffs, renationalization of industries. If we look at Poland and Hungary, a lot of the language used by the ruling parties is precisely the fact that the problem is that it's the foreigners, so either it's Brussels and its dictates, or it's
Mi akarunk dönteni, kivel akarunk élni. Mi hoćemo odlučiti s kime želimo živjeti.
Right, so the idea is that this is what I was referring to in the morning, how you refer to the solutions. In Orban's articulation, the solution is in removing foreign influences. So if we maintain control over the economy, as if this is then going to lead to better outcomes, better social outcomes. But there are analyses which say that, for instance, in Hungary, where the period of rule is long enough now to see some effects, I think we can find indicators which would say that there has been a push towards protection of the weakest and some social programs introduced, but others speak a different story. So I think that's a relatively open question, but it has, so I think what we're interested in here is, whether we can speak of, in the local context, like GVZ, when I teach my students these basic concepts, they all firmly believe that GVZ belongs here, that it has articulated the generalized sense of insecurity and directed it, because it said also again that the problem is Brussels and that we need, a monetary sovereignty, and this will solve a lot of problems and so on. So this is, I think, an open debate whether the new right belongs over here or over there. And why I said that I think I'm not sure that the populist right is the most useful way of thinking about them is because if what I've said so far is true, then they are a logical extension of the steps before. And I think that we should look at these parties, the SVP in Switzerland, and AfD, and then the case in Hungary or in Poland and so on, as a new articulation of the right. And I think that's what it is, rather than calling them right-wing populists. All right. The bottom line is that the two-dimensionality survives to an extent, but that the cultural dimension has been transformed into these new topics of immigration and Euroscepticism, and then in Eastern Europe, as I said, mostly around social conservatism. I had a slide which shows you very nicely the difference between, in the Swiss context, the SVP, the radical right, and the FDP, the radical party, which is their center-right. So that the point being that the main difference is, if we look at a number of elements of their party programs, the main difference that the SVP, which is an important example because it's the first party in Europe, which was a radical right party, to gain a plurality, meaning the largest part of the vote, already in the 1990s. And it has all the elements of what today is a very widespread phenomenon, why I think it's important and interesting to study the SVP. And if you look at them and their program and how it compares to the mainstream party of the right, the key difference is on a much stronger restrictive immigration policy and an emphasis on law and order, so addressing this generalized sense of insecurity, rather than, there isn't a big, they're equally, they have equal positions on restrictive public spending, for instance, and on economic policy generally. So this would then be in line with positioning them over here. Okay, so what is different in the periphery, or what are the elements that distinguish Eastern European context from So I think that a lot of this is equally valid, but some of the preconditions for why this space, this space is completely empty. So there's no one here. I wish I could have erased it, but now, you imagine this as empty. Why is this empty? Again, I think this part of the story is very important, but just to very well known. But just to underline some of the things which I think we should keep in mind. One is there's a lot of literature on austerity and the effects of austerity after 2008, which we tend to take for granted. But instead of taking it for granted, we should say the actual period of austerity in this region started in 1990, and the economic and social effects of the economic transformation from the beginning of the 90s, and this is shown by empirical research and a number of indicators, was way worse than the 1929 depression in the US and Europe. This was a calamitous effect on the societies of Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 90s, and it was fully predicted that this is what is going to happen. But I think we need to really kind of take that into account, because it helps explain why, for instance, in the Croatian context, the kind of this cleavage that I described as dominant around ethnic Croatian Catholic had such a firm ground, because these conditions of austerity, of a full-blown crisis of, where are we going, and this generalized sense of insecurity was there also at the beginning of the 90s. In comparison to Western Europe, this means that we had much worse conditions than there. So we know that the left was destroyed ideationally, and it was stigmatized as a force. So it's another reason why the Social Democrats at the beginning of the 90s could really do not much but accept economic liberalism as the recipe of the day. But another fundamental distinction of Eastern Europe, also from its southern periphery, like Greece and Spain and Portugal, is that there is, as we know, absolutely no left infrastructure. And this was something that we touched upon in the morning, but the morning was much more kind of focused on discourse and ideas and the material element of politics, meaning, left organizations of any kind, social organizations, unions, the existence and presence of a communist party that, always, has effects on the overall party space. All of that we lack, which means that we have to address all of the elements of left organization at the same time. Adding on to that, to this basic dynamic, is also the EU integration process, which meant that the liberal recipe that became, the recipe of the European Union, particularly after 1989 and the single market and Maastricht and so on, meant that we applied a lot of this recipe of economic liberalism much further than was the case in the core. While at the same time believing the narrative that this will lead to convergence. And this narrative was it was highly legitimized by all the political elites, which meant that we kept believing in it for a very long time. And for some of the countries of Eastern Europe, in the early 2000s, it began to materialize a sense of convergence in terms of, if you look at economic and social indicators, it looked like they might, to some extent, converge. But now, after the economic crisis of 2008, which exposed the vulnerability of the Eastern periphery to what is going on in the core, it's clear that there's no convergence. Actually, the disparities are wider and wider. And another element of how the European integration had a negative effect on capacities for some sort of local imagination for political organization and so on is the fact that, and this is something that I'm quoting from the literature, that this decade-long process of downloading the recipe for what do we need to do in the economic and social sphere and everywhere else hollowed out political content, meaning that it made even less, the differences between the mainstream right and the mainstream left were even less importance, because whoever came to power, the socio-economic recipe and what we needed to do in order to complete the conditions for accession were the same, which has obvious, negative implications for belief in the fact that elections matter and that, political struggle matters. What Nölke and Vliegenhart and others have described as dependent market economies. So trying to characterize the type or the variety of capitalism that developed in Eastern Europe, they expose the underbelly of what the mainstream discourse calls the imperative of attracting investment. We need to make our economies more attractive to foreign investment, and indeed we do, but this created a reliance on then investment decisions of transnational companies, as we know. In those sectors of the economy which have highest value added, which are important in terms of technology transfer and so on, they are owned by foreign corporations which then make decisions on investment, and this is an important part of how our economies work. Another aspect of this kind of variety of capitalism, which they call dependent market economies, is that, and this is, actually, it's so sarcastic and cynical, but this is how it's actually described in the literature, that the comparative advantage of the economies of Eastern Europe is low labor cost. This is a comparative advantage because, as they said, these previous regimes, they built up relatively good human capital, and these people are engineers, they can work, they're not just peasants, they have skills, but they're cheap. And this is supposedly our comparative advantage, which obviously cannot, it's a self-destructive type of comparative advantage, which has led to deregulated labor markets, high level of unemployment, weakened power of unions, and we know all this. This is just to kind of underlie it. And when they call it dependent market economies, they mean economies dependent on investment decisions from the core, plus a scaling down of the welfare state at the same time, because we were also told at the beginning of the 90s that we need to scale down the state. And now I would have shown you 3 slides which show maps of Europe, where it's completely clear, based on the adoption of certain parts of the kind of this economic liberal recipe, that it went further in Eastern Europe. For instance, if you look at rates of personal income tax and the preferred recipe that we should have a flat tax, the only place where this exists, where it's actually implemented, is in Eastern Europe. Nowhere in the west of Europe will you find that. Or if you look at kind of corporation tax rates across Europe, again, the recipe everywhere has been you should lower corporation tax rates. Well, if you look at the map, then again, you see a clear dividing line between the east and the west. I have maps which show this. And then again, if you look at expenditure on social protection, so this is the idea that the state was too large, supposedly, and then we need to reduce it, meaning reduce commitments to social welfare, education, health, and so on. Again, there is a dividing line in terms of percentages of social expenditure in the east and in the west. So I think, and we can go on and on, we can look at various economic and social indicators that tell the same story, that, who actually bought it. We did, which means that we created economic and social environment in which it's much, much harder to fight this kind of generally what we described as a kind of a general dynamic of political conflict in Europe today. So if we try to then draw kind of the 2 main points in ways in which the grammar of political conflict is different in Eastern Europe, is that based on this general dynamic, what was different at the beginning of the 90s was there was no challenge from the left, and it was a context where, because of the joint forces of, advice from international financial institutions, the European Union, and pretty much everyone, it was impossible to implement significant redistributive policies. And I mean, without them, you're also destroying the social fabric, which is the constituency for an emancipatory project. So no successful challenge for the left, which means, it means that we entered the big crisis of 2008 with an already strong right-wing hegemony and very few resources for a left response and for a left attack, if you wish. So that means that it's, and I mean, I guess my talk is then very in line with the title of the seminar, Weaknesses of the Left. I've told a lot about weaknesses of the left, but here I now come to the third part, which is left strategy. And what I see are important elements of left strategy. So the first important element of left strategy is to, in a way, dispute this dichotomy, to rethink or to start from a different place in trying to understand what would a class cleavage or an identity cleavage be. And I think that, and here I quote mostly from Peter Hall, who says that the core of the current predicament is the loss of decent jobs. Just a decent job. I think that's a really, really important category. So yes, all about what we already said, general sense of insecurity because of precarity, changing gender relations, the urban concentration of capital, because of rising inequality, because of various other reasons why we could think of feelings of existential insecurity. But a decent job is more than a secure job. I like the concept of a decent job because it gives way to an understanding of work as a source of identity, which is one way of disputing this, because this kind of analysis assumes you have a class cleavage or a class conflict, and then you have various types of identitarian conflicts which revolve around nationality or religious freedom and secularism and so on. And when you say when you focus on a decent job is a job which gives you a sense of perspective, a sense of, kind of self-respect, a perspective in terms of where you want to be in the future. So it points to much more than just your kind of economic position, which is what I think is important. And I think it's also relevant because when we think about left strategy, the first, in the story that I've told, it seems that the first thing to do, if we could, get a chance, is tax and redistribute. We need to immediately, because there's so much, so much depravity, so much insecurity everywhere, that if we could, we should first of all extend social benefits. This is kind of a thing that comes to mind. But this is something that the right-wing populists are also doing. They're trying to figure out ways in which they can compensate or create various types of social benefits. I think this is not the way forward in creating kind of the constituency for the left. Another thing is that it's also much more difficult to, if you want to focus in your narrative on decent jobs, this puts you under a much bigger pressure, because it's much harder to deliver changes in the economic and social structure of a given society that will deliver more decent jobs. So it's easier to promise, in a way, to make it simple. It's easier to promise if we, if we gain votes, we will commit to, progressive taxation, and then we'll redistribute. We'll protect, free education. We'll protect the health system and the social benefits. I don't think this is. Of course, it needs to be part of the package, but it's not nearly ambitious enough. We need to be much more ambitious about this. And another thing that this always reminds me to say is that if you look at more recent, kind of traumas that we had, or recent political conflicts in Croatia. One of them has been the outcome of the referendum in 2013 about the status of marriage, or the definition of marriage, which was put in the constitution. It reminds me of something that, again, is I'm not sure now where it's from, whether it's Hall or Fraser, which says middle classes are committed to universalist values, but working classes are committed to state intervention. Meaning, that the left should, I think it's always on losing ground, as I said in the beginning, if it fetishizes cultural dispositions and if it accepts the fight on the cultural, through cultural categories and doesn't try to change the conversation. And I have this picture, which some of you will see in the first rows. I've shown it in many of my talks. So it's Željka Antunović in 1994 at a rally, a political rally of the Social Democrats, and behind her she has a poster which says, "Workers are also Croats." So I use it to show in a very, I think that in itself shows how, making a distinction between cultural and class struggles is only, limited in its usefulness, because I think through this short slogan, which says workers are also Croats, this captures what happened at the beginning of the 90s, that something that was also a cultural identity, worker, was replaced with an ethnic one. Okay, so going back to elements of what I think should be part of a kind of a left intervention. I also agree with Nancy Fraser that we must start from the premise that many right-wing voters are, in principle, winnable to the left. I think this is a given, because if any of this analysis holds, then we live in a period of strong right-wing hegemony, and if we don't think that we need to be talking to people who vote for the right, then we have no business in politics. I think we have to start from, and I can explain this further in the questions if you want me to. Now, what would be elements of a counter-hegemonic narrative, if you like, of a left strategy? One, I think that we need to, and now I'm really addressing what I see as, the task for left political actors in the Croatian context, but I do think that it's applicable to other places as well. I think that the first thing is to be able to just outright say that the social outcomes of these grand state projects that we had, since the 90s, which were have your own state and then join NATO and join the EU and all of that, were an abysmal failure from the perspective of, the conditions of life, and that we, immediately have to try and stop further peripheralization. This doesn't really exist in English, but we have already become, comparatively speaking, if you look at economic and social indicators from 20 or 30 years ago, we are sinking very fast into peripheries. So no longer semi-peripheries, regions which have elements of the core which can catch up with the right policies, but strong peripheries, because we have structures of economies, if you look at Croatia, where, as I say, if we continue with business as usual, we will only need cooks and waiters and, carers, so low-skilled, precarious, short-term work and nothing else. So this is the kind of the economic outlook for the country if we continue as we are. So we need to be able to say, okay, obviously what has been called development and joining the West has been a grand scheme and a failure, and we need to be able to, and I use this hesitantly, but we need to be able to regain sovereignty over interpreting our role within the EU. Particularly now, speaking from the Croatian context, as a member state, I think that we should take into consideration the fact that the process of European integration is fundamentally asymmetric in terms of power. So if you want to join, there's a list of things you need to do, and there's very little compromise. You have to accept the rules. But now that we're in, I think that we really should kind of become aware of the fact that every member state interprets and goes against and disobeys regulations, and that we should really be, this should be a starting point for some kind of change. Because on the one hand, if we, I don't see a point in developing a left program without an industrial strategy and without a strategy which would, in a significant way, introduce changes to economic institutions and how we govern our society. A second part, which I think is a must or an imperative, is a direct articulation of the class cleavage. And I think that this can be done in the context of Croatia and our neighboring countries through something that is, I think, still present in everybody's kind of private family histories, and that's a sense of a lost social mobility. The fact that your background ever more, as time goes by in these societies, your background is becoming stronger and stronger in determining your life chances. And I can back this up with, a lot of data to show that where you live in Croatia, whether it's a small town or a village or a smaller community, and whether you attend, do you attend at all preschool, and then what kind of school you go to is closing off many doors. So it's something that we have, as I say, I think there's a strong sense still of a history, a recent history, where in 2 generations you could go from, your grandparents having maybe four years schooling, and you have a doctoral degree, which is the case in my family, to a society in which this is no longer possible, and I think that's a way in which you can introduce the topic of a class cleavage without using, very complicated either vocabulary ideas. This is something that's very close to people's experiences, and I think looking at also various empirical research that we've done, surveys and so on, this is something that is felt indeed as a grievance and as a social injustice. People feel that, whether you're rich or poor, how this affects your education outcomes, they find this, in Croatia, they find this utterly, unacceptable. So this is a way in. And this then does mean, talking about also progressive taxation and addressing the initial accumulation from the 90s of capital and how it was done. We have already a strong presence of a general narrative that this was unjust. That the creation of the 200 rich families was a deep injustice done to these societies. And I think now, because we're already living in a time in which these nouveau riches are now, handing over inheritance to the second generation, we need to tax this, and we need to really introduce ambitious policies that can address also that feeling of injustice that's already present among the people that live here. And then a third part of this, all of this I see under the topic of a kind of class cleavage, is we need to really delve into the elements of, or the key characteristics of the welfare state in Croatia. Because the story, as I've told it in a stylized way, of, kind of reducing the size of the state and reducing levels of support for social groups, for education, for health, and so on, is part of the story, kind of this commodification and privatization and all that. But at the same time, I think that in the case of Croatia, there's been a change in the morphology of the welfare state, where it now strongly supports traditional and patriarchal relations. So again, creates material links to this kind of political identities and then mobilizations to vote, and whereby I also mean, for instance, large programs for veteran groups, which then create, again, something that's a material underbelly of a symbolic link between voters and parties. And I can talk again more about these. These are just kind of to open up maybe questions. And then the third part and the final part is kind of a strengthening of the democratic process. I mean, that's what I called it. But I think a key delineation of the left from everybody else, so from the conservatives on the one hand and the liberals on the other, is a belief in the democratic process, irrespective of, you know, the fact that you feel that sometimes the democratic process doesn't yield wise outcomes. Both the conservatives and the liberals share a conception of the people, if you like, as something to be manipulated. So in the conservative version of things, these are, you know, uneducated, not really informed, not competent, shouldn't decide on anything really, and should defer authority to strong leaders. But it's the same thing with liberals as well. It's just that in the liberal discourse they say, in the future, when we educate everyone, when, you know, because this is a political culture which is, you know, it's not democratic, people are not used to making these decisions, they are still somehow backward and so on. So they introduce this element of a future in which it's possible to include everyone in decision making, but not today, right? Because people today are not of the right disposition to participate. And I think so. The only political force to say no, but we need to actually design institutions so that people co-decide, they become part of decisions over their economic and political and social circumstances today, because it is through participation and through designing institutions that matter that you will create then also the dispositions that you perhaps now fear that people don't have. So I think that's something that we need to build into everything that we do, meaning that you need to build this into concrete policies, like, you know, to what extent do we, I don't know, decentralized decision-making? How easy do we make it for cities to be co-run by citizens, to be able to, I don't know, call off a mayor and co-participate and co-decide on key issues in neighborhoods and so on, all the way to widening participation for direct democratic involvement and so on. So various, you know, a whole palette of institutional possibilities that need to be open. And at the same time, and I tried to kind of make this argument in the morning, also understand that for the kind of a really fundamental task for the left is to not be representing, but to be organizing. And this is the hard part of things, which means that we, the way I see, you know, how our approach to this context of, you know, democratic capitalism in which we now work, how our approach is different, is that we want people who will over time be involved in more and more decisions by themselves. So that's what I think emancipatory politics is about. And if we accept this narrative, and if we look at all the economic and social indicators which show the extent to which social fabric is destroyed, you know, in which people work in conditions which make it really hard to undertake collective projects and to think about anything outside of survival. You know how the yellow vests, somebody this morning was saying, we want to live, not to survive. And politics is a space for those who are living, not for those who are surviving. So this is a fundamental challenge for us, which is why, as I was saying in the morning, why I think electoral politics is a necessity for various reasons, and I can come back to that. But for left organization and for left struggle, it's only one tool for what the task is. So the elections and the outcomes of elections are not the task. The task is supporting, building, and organizing everywhere so that we create spaces for collective decision-making. That's the task. And the electoral struggles and wins can support this task. And that's kind of the order of things the way I see it. And I think that's pretty much what I've prepared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danijela, for the lecture. I'm sorry for the lack of logistical support. So we have some time for a few questions before the general discussions, also comments and any other kind of rhetorical interventions which are polite are okay. So please, floor is yours. Ask questions and comments. Yes.
I'm sorry, I want to be polite, but I wanted to illustrate how Orban and Fidesz are doing that in Hungary. I used to watch Hungarian television, but in the last 2 or 3 years, all televisions, 95%, half of the time are using in the campaign against immigrants. But if you are looking in the reality, immigrants are not a danger for Hungary, because asylum in Hungary for asylum asked only 560 or 40 people, but in the same times in Netherlands, each year 20,000 got the asylum, and everybody stands in the Netherlands, but in Hungary nobody stayed. So, and if you look, if immigrants are dangerous, it's 5,000 times is more dangerous to cross the street. So, but they won the election, and I've told that after the election they will stop with the campaign, and even now cannot open Hero.hu, or it is a news point Hungary. I can't open it because all the time they are doing post-campaign. And so how we can cope against that misleading, and they are always trying to threaten people with no real treatment. And the same is in Croatia, and I can see their way, but a little light show me in Ireland. In Ireland, nobody practically can say, Dira, do it. The God is with you. Or you cannot answer, Dira Moire, do it, which is traditional. The Mary is with you, but rather they say hello. If you tell them to them, Dira, do it, they are not satisfied. But we know how Catholic Church was strong in Ireland. But now it's quite a different position, and after all, most of Croatians has to learn Gaige, has to learn Irish, Labra in Gaige. No? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for interruption, but I wanted to tell you the slogan in Hungary was mi akarunk dönteni, kivel akarunk élni. We want to decide with whom we want to live. We have our European values and so on, but they've forgotten that Jesus and father of Jesus, Josip, or John, or how to say in English, I'm not quite sure, and Mary was looking for asylum. But they are also from the Middle East, and the father of this Steve Jobs is also from Middle East. After all, thank you.
Right. No, I think it was great. I didn't mind your interruption, even though I didn't speak Hungarian, so I wasn't sure what was, but I was quite clear that you wanted to help me rather than hinder me. Just to build on what you were saying in the Hungarian context, what the story that I was trying to draw on the board was that Hungary, like all the rest of Eastern Europe, has economic and social indicators that show a growing sense of economic insecurity. What Orban did was, successfully explain that the problem is that the ethnic Hungarians are attacked or betrayed by, and then, it's a palette. It's as was said in the morning, by Soros, by Brussels, by foreign interests, by Jews, by Roma, by immigrants. So it can, the place of the minority, the other, changes because you want to be able to address, cross-class or cross-society. You want to be able to address various types of grievances or senses of insecurity, so you change the target. You can change it. This is, political pragmatism on his behalf. He looks at polls and he looks at other elements, and then, but the point is that what is, in that sense, he does, or this kind of politics, right-wing populism, does address, a change of heart with respect to policies of economic liberalism. Everybody was on board 20 years ago. That more, when I say everybody, I mean, according to opinion polls and general kind of empirical analysis of voters, everybody was still buying the idea that economic freedom, removing barriers to capital, labor, goods and services is a good thing because it will bring growth and it will trickle down. Today, nobody believes it. That's why I think everybody, if we think of people, everybody's here. I mean, nobody except the urban, educated, credentialized elite is over there, believing that more economic freedom will bring benefits. So that's a change in context, but this grievance over economic globalization is strongly articulated as a cultural thing. As the solution is simple: eliminate from the community the foreign interest, and this is how you solve the problem. And it's, of course, you're not solving it, but Orban is, managed to win 3 rounds of elections and second time again supermajority with this kind of platform. Yeah.
You mentioned that any sort of left strategy must entail some sort of industrial policy, industrial strategy, isn't it? So I would like maybe you can use some time to expand on that because just industrial strategy in general could remind someone on various historical alliances of West European social democracy with the parts, fractions of their local bourgeoisies, which and these alliances, of course, didn't always end well for these social democrats. So probably we need to ask ourselves who will take the responsibility for investment decisions, who will take the role of investor, and so on.
Okay. I mean, I don't have the answers. I think I'm at I'm at 3 steps earlier than I think addressing all of the things that you would like me to address. Looking at the common sense, the way that these topics are discussed currently in our society and related societies, I think that we need to reintroduce the idea that development is planned, because of the particular historical experience of Eastern Europe as opposed to West, we completely abandoned the idea that you need to, if you want to have social outcomes of economic activities of any kind, that this entails planning. And that's one of the reasons why we have economic and social indicators much worse than in the West. So this is a modest proposal. I hate to use that Varoufakis's claim, but it's a modest proposal for saying, okay, but if you look at the political economy of Croatia today, you have these high value-added sectors like finance, banking, telecom, and so on, which are owned by foreign companies and investment decisions are made by them. Then you have some segments of the economy which are in a crony relationship, or whatever you want to call it, insider privileged relationships, such as Agrokor and so on. And then the rest has been left to whatever happens when you deregulate, liberalize, and so on. And the effects are as they are. So I think that simply starting by saying, can we, within the given context of and the limitations of what we've accepted, and that's EU membership, what is the scope for developing, for instance, ideas and strategies for greater autonomy of food production, energy production, and so on. And just, I think, destigmatizing the idea that this should be put on the table, and we should be able to, like the Corbyn Labour Party has an industrial strategy, and it's a general part of any serious governmental attempt. While here, the only space for strategies has been within what I called downloading from the EU. So we still produce strategies, but their only purpose is to be able to take funds from the European Union. So it's always a very instrumental, short-term, bureaucratic intervention. It's never an idea that it's us that should be thinking of kind of a social and a general national interest. So that's as best I can really address that now. Yeah.
It's from Machine. So I have two questions to ask. Would you say that there's a grain of salt in hypothetical, let's say, proposition that these negative impacts of globalization could be, I don't know, stopped or turned the other way around by limiting the flows of capital? So, say, strengthening national borders again, like Johannes Becker, say, proposes. And if so, how would we do it without further fueling ethno-nationalism?
Yeah, these are questions like $1 million question. If anybody can address this, show me that person. I don't know. Reversing or re-regulating flows of capital is obviously on the agenda, but it's not something that will be addressed by the New Left Party here in Croatia. It has to be an alliance, and it has to be so this kind of disobedience and resistance to what is currently dominant policy direction will only happen when some of the stronger forces join as well. So, we can say it's important, but I don't think it's within the remit of what I'm now looking at, which is how do we build a left platform for Croatia. So I'm a bit more modest.
Is it possible to introduce the discourse of anti-capitalism explicitly, or left parties have to work inside this hegemony of capitalist discourse and then start with the participation and strengthening of the communities you mentioned, and then work towards something maybe more radical? So my question is, capitalist planning for now the same as anti-capitalism, or by anti-capitalism or going to the left, do we actually mean capitalist planning? And
I understand your question. I'm not sure. I think that I'm trying to imagine going to, I don't know, Sisak or Sinj or Glina or anywhere and figuring this out. What is the first sentence, what is the second, and what is the third? And in some instances, I think that indeed kind of the general sentiment is anti-capitalist, that you shouldn't kind of go around this. But I think a responsible left actor will also delve into all the limitations of a peripheral position. So for us, I think it is yes, we should articulate that real changes or like substantial changes, which are not alleviations, entail a change of economic structure. But if it's true what we were saying, that we want to build a constituency, then improving material life conditions is an imperative. So it's not trivial to improve people's life conditions, because by improving their life conditions, we create the environment in which we'll have a constituency. Yeah. So I think hopefully we can say both. We can say that the aims are transformative, but because of the but it also, I think that partly this is also different whether you're asking me how we should be doing this in the field, in organizing, and whether you're asking me in how do we do an electoral campaign. I think this is also perhaps some nuances will be different.
When we are talking about these different in this graph, this universal tradition and this class conflict line. I think that in the situation in Croatia, but also maybe in most of the post-socialist countries, that these some kind of historical class conflictual lines are now translated in a sense, and really complicated way, in a cultural. So when you say Croat ethnic, it's also versus not only urban cosmopolites or whatever when you talk about Western Europe, but also against Yugoslav identity, which is, of course, in a sense, identical with socialism. So you have some kind of historical, different type of memories, cultural memories of class conflict that are now translated into cultural conflict. In a sense, that is also, from the perspective of the left, you can also see it as some kind of advantage that these two things, in a sense, collide. But also, it's much more difficult to deal with that historical baggage. In a sense, you also have a so-called sometimes nice opportunity that also the liberals and the conservatives of different kinds see everything about some kind of remnants of socialism, but it's different that conservatives think that liberals are socialists, and liberals think that conservatives are socialists because of the benefits for veterans or something like that. It's very complicated. Of course, now the Yugoslavia and socialism work as a tool for defamation, but I think that it's also in some other countries in the West, you can see this. Here is this Yugoslav elites. In some Western countries, you can refer to this, 68, post-68 elites. But this kind of, I think it's somehow, it will be, I don't know how to put it in a graphic way, but to introduce past historical, political, and class battles into this graph to see how these sediments of political history is being in some way represented in contemporary divides between culture or economic scale.
Right. No, I think that what you describe, it has been. I don't think it no longer maybe is, but it was an additional burden for rehabilitation of the left. The fact that the nationalist, state-building project was against ethnic minorities, but Yugoslavs and communists, so it was all conflated together. This creates, so it delegitimized what is, in a democratic framework, a legitimate political position. It became equal with traitor, with national traitor. So that's why rehabilitation could only happen with a generation of students in 2008 and 2009, because it represents a generational break. This is the first time that somebody could say, but I have nothing to do, I really have, nothing to do with what was going on 20 or 30 years ago. I think that was why, even though initially it was very hard, but why the student movement of 2008 changes the conversation. So for the first time introduces in a mainstream discussion in what we call the public sphere, introduces elements of what could be considered a class cleavage, and they can do it because they don't wear that stigma. I think that was really important. But another element of what you were saying is about this very strong Orientalism or auto-colonialism and auto-racism, I don't know what to call it, which is very present in also the common sense, so ways in which in Croatia we explain why we are the way we are. When we explain why we are at the back end of Europe, why we fail on all the indicators, we generally fall back on this descriptor according to which it's the wrong kind of heritage. It's a socialist mentality and its various sorts. But I think we do need to address that also quite explicitly and say what it is. It's an expression of class contempt, which is shared by both the conservative and the liberal elites. It's a way of class contempt in the sense that it mystifies something that are actual social and economic relations. It mystifies them into some sort of mentality and shifts the blame. It's a fantastic device because whatever you do, you cannot succeed. The reforms are always unsuccessful because the mentality makes them impossible to implement. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of a failed society. So I think it's a pathogen element that we need to really deal with very explicitly.
Well, we have one comment and one question, well, but they're interrelated. I mean, the comment is that I found really interesting 2 points that you made, the reference to decent work and the reference to an industrial policy. I think that the reference to a decent work or the demand for decent job for everyone is really important because, since the majority of what we can define as the people are persons that have to basically sell their labor, sell their labor in order to survive, and since we fully understand that without a decent job, there's no point about talking about any form of inclusive citizenship or so any form of actually having a political sphere, because it's exactly precariousness or social exclusion that undermines this position. So this is I think, a very important, and it's a way where, let's say, the democratic and the social demand in a certain way coincide. It's not just an economic demand, it's a fundamental also political demand, so that all people have a kind of fulfilling relationship to the social and consequently the political sphere. And I also understand that I also find it very interesting that your reference to an industrial policy, both in the technical sense of it, but also in a broader sense, that instead of the left simply asking for redistribution or a change, it should ask for an actual change in the developmental pattern or paradigm. And it is also a very interesting way, I think, it's a debate that has to be opened on the left. Instead of simply focusing on macroeconomic questions like austerity or monetary sovereignty, which of course I find them very, very important, if we go towards industrial policy, it is a way to bring back socialist politics in a very concrete way, what it means to, and you can also address ecological aspects, but also social questions in a more profound way. And this will be part of an attempt to be hegemonic. If you actually suggest an alternative, this is a country, what can it produce, how it can produce, under which social relations, and towards what aims, benefits, and goals. This is an actual hegemonic discourse, and there are moments when this comes to the fore. I mean, in Greece, during the period of the crisis, because it was not just an economic crisis, it was a political, social crisis, but it was also a developmental crisis, a crisis of an entire paradigm of managing the economy. And it was as if the entire set of illusions about growth that were formed in the 1990s, the idea that Europeanization, openness and competitiveness would be the road to growth, came to an end. So, I mean, it was an open space there for the left to regain. It didn't, but because if it had, it would mean that it would have had an industrial policy, and if it had had an industrial policy, it would be the failure we know. But still, there are moments where you can talk about this, and I think this is very important in the European context. So this is the question is, of course, is how is this possible to have it in the contemporary European context? And I'm not simply referring to the Eurozone, since Croatia is not part of the Eurozone, which is at least something positive. I mean, we understand the violence of the Eurozone, but we must also take into consideration that the very process of European integration can be very detrimental to the social fabric and also to the productive fabric of a country. I mean, if we look at Greece or other countries, and not just look at the period after the introduction of the euro, you look at the period from 1981, which was the official entrance of Greece, until the euro, which is like 20 years, more than 20 years, the changes were enormous. I mean, there were productive sectors that were dismantled. There were changes in production patterns, in consumption patterns. There's a more profound way in which European integration affects, and if we take into consideration that, for example, a very important aspect of European integration is exactly to make sure that no country can have a kind of industrial policy or planning. I mean, if you have forced privatization, you have an entire set of forced deregulation of sectors. And since countries become more and more dependent upon, especially peripheral countries, upon cohesion programs come at a very big price regarding what kind of investment you can fund or what kind of to which direction. So I think even without the Eurozone, there is a strong case on the impossibility of having a different, really different economic policy within the current European context. And I'm saying this on the basis of the experience of the inequalities and the transformations induced by European integration, and not simply by the very structural and very obvious violence of the Eurozone. So that's the question, if it's possible.
Right. Well, I have to start from the premise that it is, but just to say a few more words on this concept of a decent job, because you also highlighted it. For me, everything that you say, I agree, and plus, I wanted to. I'm not sure the extent to which I was successful in conveying ways in which a decent job is about security. So it's a fundamental way to address this generalized sense of insecurity that we now face as a kind of element of the current conjuncture. But more than that, it's a decent job is a way in which your professional role is an identity. And this has profound implications for social interactions, political interactions. And if you work, shit job, bullshit jobs, insecure jobs, there's no space for a development of a professional identity, which leads to, autonomy, pride, and various, aspects of us as people to be able to open to the collective, to say I can contribute this and so on, and so that's why it's a fundamental obstacle to a left constituency, because we have to now, when we try to organize on the left and we try to build what is a left actor, a left force, we have to abandon the idea, which was here for a long time, that people's political orientations are loyal, because they're not. They either don't exist, or if they do, they're completely disloyal, because if everything is in shift, if your circumstances in your where you're going to live and under what conditions and so on, I think we need to draw the implications of that also for political organizing. And when we were setting up Zagreb i Naš, one of the reasons why we try to implement and adapt the idea of a platform was because we saw that even those of us who have the resources, who have somewhat better, at least some of the aspects of our lives, have some of the resources for political organizing, but in order to get people to commit, you need to create a framework of easy entry, easy exit. People are no longer, in life conditions which will allow them or even, dispose them towards saying, I'll chip into this. This is my thing. I know that you have your failures, but I'll give here. No, I mean, what we see all the time is people want to be able to say, sometimes I'm with you, and on some things I'm with you, but sometimes I'm not. And we have to start from there, because this is the best that we can work with. Perhaps over time this can change, but I think it can only change if people's life, work conditions and life conditions change. And it's a fundamental predicament that we're in. So that's about the decent job, why I think it's important. The industrial policy, I think in Eastern Europe, here in Croatia and in other countries that I know of, we took the dictate too far. We flipped it over. I mean, we have situations where, German and Austrian companies which are state-owned buy here, and we say it's fine. And then there is a directive which says you should, deregulate your railway system, and then we create 3 companies out of 1. These are ridiculous proposals from anybody's perspective. It's not a left perspective. This is ridiculous. It cannot create efficiency. So I think in one aspect we can make improvements just by saying let's use some elementary economic logic in applying rules, right? Because everybody does it all the time. That's why I say that in the East the recipe was taken too far, for various reasons. Sometimes people want, whatever, for various reasons. So I think even within the straitjacket, within many rules that you have to comply with, you can make steps forward, and I think we should also disobey. I think that we should test. I think it's also fine to say an economic strategy and industrial policy should test some limits, because again, states do this. I don't think this is radically a left proposal. I think it's just like a decent proposal. Yeah. So it's a combination.
Okay, we will stop here and have a 15 minutes break, and then we will continue with a general discussion in which we will discuss again these questions and others which are not addressed immediately after the lectures. This one and also the panel, this one in the morning.